There you go, great. Today I want to talk about the best stuff of the Middle Ages. For two reasons. One, I was originally drafting these lectures to be mostly just kind of chronological, walking through and kind of keeping track of all that's going on as you walk through time. And it just becomes so complicated. There's so many different factors kind of weaving in that the lecture became sort of hopelessly kind of this thing and this thing and this thing and this thing, and there was nothing holding it together other than time. And it's also the case that I think this period, 800-1300, is one of the most undervalued periods of human history. That we think of it now on the other side of humanism and the Renaissance, and which sort of scorned the Middle Ages, as we're going to see, as Gothic, which was the best insult they could level, out of the Gothic tribes against the products of these centuries. But actually, there was a ton of tremendous stuff going on. There was also a ton of tremendous bad stuff. And so what I've done is just taken a nice little moral butter knife and I just sliced off the good stuff for today. And then our next week's lecture is going to be all the bad stuff in one go. But I wanted to do it in this order because I think we're fairly well familiar Enlightenment writing of the 18th and 19th century, trickling down into novels, even down to the present era, have sort of immortalized the infamy of the Crusades, of the Inquisition, of the stuff we usually think of. So I think we don't need to spend as much time there because we know some of it. I will as well, but I want to talk about the good stuff today. So all that to say, I'm aware there's plenty of bad stuff. We're going to spend the whole time next time in the muck. But today we're going to look at the good stuff. Yeah.
I have a question before you start.
Please.
We talked about this last week. Okay, as far as Muslims praying to Mecca or to the east, so if you are east of Mecca,
Yeah.
do you pray 5 times a day? Do you actually pray west?
Yes, you face Mecca.
Okay.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
it's not east, it's Mecca.
It's Mecca, right? Yeah, but of course in the West, that is east, by nature of where Mecca is, right? Very devout Muslims will even calibrate kind of within a degree. They'll have some sense of, which way Mecca is in their ordinary prayer times. If they can't get a real sense of exactly where they are for where Mecca is, they'll sort of generalize, I think, to east. And it's similar with Jews. They'll pray towards Jerusalem, but generally east if you're in the West. But Christians, that's not so. Christians, if you are east of the Levant, Christians still prayed facing east. There was no turning around to an earthly city because it was always this looking forward towards the rising sun. So, yeah. Yeah.
Hotels in Muslim countries, in your motel room or your hotel room, there will be an arrow on the ceiling telling you which way to pray.
No way. I did not know that. That's really cool. Yeah. That's really cool. Did everyone hear that? Hotels in Muslim countries will have an arrow for which way Mecca is. That's really interesting. Yeah.
We had some good friends that lived here for a while. He was in grad school and they were Muslim. They were over at our house for dinner. The first time, and after dinner, he said, "Is there a quiet room where I can do one of my prayers?" Because it was time, and it was late in the evening. And I said, "Yeah, over here." I showed him the den. And then he said, "Which way is east?" I said, "Well, I don't know exactly, but I got my Boy Scout compass."
Yeah. Yeah.
Fixed up, then closed the door, and he was fine.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the devotion of faithful Muslims today should rightly be a shame to Christians. Like they are exemplary in regular commitment to the spiritual life, to a life of prayer, as Christians once were, and now we've become really slack. And so I was at a truck stop not long ago, maybe about a year ago now. And here I am, I've got kids and just truck stop, busy road, trying to rush home. And there were these 2 truckers who, driving their big rigs, had stopped and they laid out their prayer mat and together they prayed. They just looked like 2 friends just praying. Took their 10 to 15 minutes to pray, rolled up their mats, got back into the truck to pray. And I was so ashamed. I'm like, here I am, supposedly a minister of the Lord and a public professor of the Christian religion. I'm too busy to make time for the prayer, because I have a rule of prayer. I mean, it's not as regular as Muslims, they do 5 times a day, but for me it's morning and evening. And I was just blowing right through my evening prayers because I was too busy. I'm like, man, And I was really sort of inspired and sort of rightly sort of shamed for my own half-heartedness. So yeah, there's definitely something that very admirable in that. Speaking of admirable, that's the segue to a time of more zealous devotion. You'll remember last time we talked about the theological developments in the East, in Byzantium, the lingering fragment of the Roman Empire. We're going to now return to the West. I'm going to try and use these kind of binary slides to kind of imprint it in our minds as we keep jumping back and forth. But we're going to pick up where we left off with sort of Charlemagne, the establishing of the Frankish kingdom, and the sort of Carolingian Renaissance under his care. So this is what we're going to look at today. Monastic reform, cathedrals, scholasticism and universities, and actually we're not going to get to St. Louis. I'm going to save him for the next lecture so we can have one nice note in the midst of all the misery next time. So what I want to show actually very simply is this sort of just threefold movement to keep in our minds as we understand both church history, and in so many ways this is where, you know how some roads are simultaneously, you know, I-85 and Highway 280, you know, like in many ways this is both church history and Western, you know, history too. There's this overlap here. But to see the connection between monasteries, education, cathedrals, and universities kind of like developing in that sequence and out of each other, and then from the different monastic movements, some different strands of intellectual thought and theological life as well. So that's kind of where we're going. And so a very large portion of the time we'll spend together today is on different movements within monasticism. And although that might seem, and it is, like just a portion of the church history, it's the most salient portion for this era because it's a time when the life of monks had such a big influence on the life of the wider church that many, many local churches, their pastor was a priest monk who was connected to that region. And so there was, what happened in the monasteries overflowed into the general culture. And I've seen differing statistics. It's hard to get statistics for this period because documentation until the Doomsday Book, and even then for a while after, isn't that thorough. But you know, a very large portion of the populace was connected to the church in some way, either as like a minor cleric or a priest or a monk. I've seen estimates as much as 10% of the population was at some level under sort of church authority. So a big emphasis on monasticism. Well, one of the things I want to clarify at the beginning is now I think we think of monks as priests, and in the later Middle Ages it would be the case that many, many were. But remember from the lecture series before, the early church, monasticism is a lay movement, right? It's just Christians wanting to live out their life sincerely. And that continues. There were priests who were monks, but it's important that at this era we keep them distinct. So I want to talk about a place called Cluny. First of all, a man named St. Benedict of Aniane. One of the most annoying things of the next 30 minutes is every major figure, his name begins with the letter B, and every major movement begins with the letter C. So if you can't keep track of them at all, I've spent about 10 years trying to keep track of them, and I still lose track. So here's Benedict of Aniane. He's sometimes called a second Benedict, and he was the one who, in Charlemagne's time, you'll remember, Charlemagne, part of his sort of vision was hybridizing church and state administrative structures so that he could have these learned monks overseeing the administration of different aspects of his kingdom. And so with wealth, as one of the things that Jesus predicted very early on, is that wealth makes you want to love it, and the love of money is the root of all evil. Actually, that's St. Paul writing to Timothy. But Jesus tells many, many parables about sort of how the love of the things of this world and wealth will choke out a pure love of the gospel and a sincere Christian life. So one of the things we're going to see century after century, just marching forward now, is expansion and wealth, moral decay, need for reform. I'm just going to see that cycle over and over and over again over 500 years. So in Charlemagne's time, the Benedictine monastic foundations with this sort of Irish influence, remember from the first lecture, needed some reform to get back to kind of like following the rule earnestly, and one of the men who championed that was named Benedict of Aniane. His principles were really installed at this one monastery in Cluny. It was not originally built like this, but this is, I think, probably an 11th century structure. So pretty close. So it was founded in 909, and it was really set up as, we are going to go back to the Benedictine way. We're going to enough with all this administrative structure. Like Benedict's idea is that monks would be men of prayer. And you pray together in community in the choir offices of the church. And so it was this real return to the Benedictine rule, kind of in its original genius. St. Odo was one of the chief founding abbots. William the Pious was a local prince. And many monasteries sort of heard about this or visited, and they were like, wow, we got to become more, we got to do this too. And so they kind of took the name of Cluny, and they became Cluniac monasteries, and actually sort of rendered themselves as subsidiary monasteries. There was this sort of structure where Cluny, the actual Cluny, became this executive head of this sort of reform movement of monasticism. And for 2 or 3 generations, it was an earnest, good movement, and it really returned a life of prayer to monasticism. It reprioritized the centrality of the daily round of prayers, those 7 prayer periods a day, which got sort of well established in the 4th and 5th centuries, and especially under St. Benedict of Nursia. The Cluniac leaders were very able administrators. They were a learned bunch, right, in the wake of the Carolingian Renaissance. And so the lands that they managed were managed very well. And so they started to get wealthy. And with wealth became, their priority was prayer. So when they acquired all this wealth, they would make more things out of gold and get more beautiful paintings around the altar. And everything just kind of get more and more elaborate and embellished. And then the monks said, well, we shouldn't be getting our hands dirty with the soil while we've got to pray in these beautiful robes. And okay, well, we got enough money. Let's hire other guys to do the farming, even though Benedict said, no, a monk must pray and work. And so they become sort of chiefly just these kind of luxurious singers who just sing all day. And they were well-meaning, but they had lost the plot of both Benedictinism and its core, and really a vision of Christianity that doesn't have much space for luxury and wealth, right? I mean, the founder, remember, Jesus, as he famously said, had nowhere to lay his head, let alone a building that looked like that. So Cluny itself was in need of reform. And just, they had become even when they were sort of no longer purists, they were a very powerful monastery. And so many, many monasteries came under their influence and executive leadership. So what began as a reform movement by the turn of 1100 was itself in need of reform, right? There's a familiar trajectory, right? We see this with so many institutions. I used to be in the theater, and you'd see some awesome, earnest bunch of like real artisans, like producing these great pieces of theater, and they'd be successful, and they'd sell tickets, so they'd get money, so they'd build a big building, and then they'd get a board of directors, and then they'd get all these rules, and then all of a sudden it's just another professional theater, right? No offense to professional theater, but it had lost that live spark. It seems to be a sociological phenomenon. So there was many different responses to the need for this reform, right? When we sort of see this sort of first wave of reform, there's kind of this one show in town. But when they decay, it's like, wow, we really tried to just go back to Benedict. Maybe we should try other stuff. So from here now, at the turn of 1100, we see this explosion of sort of re-envisionings of monastic life. The biggest one is the Cistercians, and then all these other ones. See what I mean about the letter C? Camaldolese, and the Carthusians, and the Carmelites, and the Canons Regular, and the Premonstratensians, or as a Benedictine monk I know likes to call them, the Monstrous Pretentians. That's not very charitable. But so I want to look at each of these in turn, and just sort of so you can see some of the sort of bouquet of monastic life, which, just to give you a teaser where we're going, is we'll show that will pave the way for the really largest movements of this era, the friars, the Dominicans and the Franciscans. So the Cistercians are named from Citeaux, which is the place, a monastic house, which was founded by Robert of Malem and 3 friends. And they actually just had the same idea as the Cluniacs, right? Return to the rule of Benedict. But they had seen the mistake. They're like, we have to keep manual labor in our constitution, right? Cluny made the mistake of just singularly saying we need to get back to prayer. The Cistercians said, yeah, absolutely get back to prayer. We need to do that too. But also that simplicity, the rejection of the world and of wealth, rejection of sort of these other executive tasks which got taken on, but also a return to manual labor, that monks should be workers, just like St. Benedict had in mind. So the Cistercians would actually go into sort of the waste edgelands of Europe, the sort of marshy fens and woodlands that weren't, with bad soil, and they would plant their monasteries there where they couldn't get huge, big, wealthy, farmlands over time. They adopted a different habit. There was a white habit instead of a black one. And they really emphasized the love of God in their preaching, right? It was one of the things we're going to see with sort of movement and message go together through the Middle Ages, that as a movement begins in earnest, the preaching becomes more earnest. And they really return to a message of the love of God. Compared to church architecture in America, these might not look very simple, but compared to some of the elaborate things that wealthier ages produced, Cistercian chapels and churches were very simple. This is Saint-Anc in France. This is in Spain. Just simple arches, no gilding, no big figurative sculptures, no fancy linens, just a big empty stone room where you could pray. The Cistercians were wildly popular. They also really developed this idea of lay brothers, people who just wanted to be a part of the community but didn't want to become a monk. So they weren't just a hired hand, they really were sort of part of the community, but they didn't take vows. They didn't maybe come to all of the prayer offices. They did a bit more manual labor, but they were sort of all in it together. There was a real earnestness to Cistercianism. It too was really popular. By the end of 1300, there'd be 500 monasteries in Europe. 500! I mean, Europe's not that big a place. 500 monasteries that were Cistercian. They also had a different structure. Rather than having this sort of executive head like Cluny, where all the wealth kind of filtered up, they organized themselves just by association. Every monastery was independent, and the abbots had to get together if they wanted to make decisions for the order as a whole. And what we see actually in some of these early monastic constitutions is very early sort of associative, governmental sort of thinking, which really paves the way for later Enlightenment, government experiments. One of the most famous early sons of the Cistercian movement was Bernard of Clairvaux. Have most of you heard of Bernard of Clairvaux? Is he still a household name? Oh, he's not? Oh, great. Well, he's going to be today. So here's the years of his life. He was the first abbot of Clairvaux. He was just right on the heels, an early adopter of Cistercianism, takes a small band of his friends and family members. This is an 18th century painting by, this hangs in my house. Ever since I saw it, and it took my breath away, I can't get over it. This is St. Bernard, and the painting is called Christ Embracing St. Bernard. And this is the Lord sort of shown as if coming down from the cross to give Bernard a hug. And this actually typifies in artistic form so much of the message of St. Bernard, right? That God actually loves us. And himself delighted in the love of God. He wrote a book called The Love of God. You could look it up on Google Books and read it. He emphasized personal religion, not just sacramental participation. He's sometimes called the last of the fathers in the West. Remember that category of church fathers, which we lump Augustine and John Chrysostom and Justin Martyr into? Sometimes when we try and figure out, like, when does sort of the age of the fathers end and when does sort of speculative scholasticism begin, Bernard is often cited as the last of them. I really want to zoom in on Bernard because it provides this launching point for a couple other things I want to point to in this era. But before I do, any questions or? Okay. So Bernard left behind a series of sermons on the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs is a book that's in the Hebrew Bible, traditionally ascribed to Solomon. It's classed with the wisdom literature. And it's, on the face of it, love poetry. It's wedding poems between this a bride and a bridegroom, and the sort of the difficulty in like finding each other, and they're coming together in marriage, and it's this romantic poetry. So chapter 1, verse 2, if you crack open your Bible, you could find this, and it says, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is more delightful than wine." And when most Christians read this today, they say, "Oh, what a nice love poem." And I think at some level it was originally written as a love poem. Interestingly, the Jewish people in the Midrash we see, they always interpreted it allegorically as a picture of God's love for his people. I mean, it was always understood as an allegory. The idea that it's just some human love poem was a brand new idea in the late 18th century. So anyways, this is Bernard's commentary on this verse. During my frequent ponderings on the burning desire with which the patriarchs, and by that he means Abraham and Moses and Solomon, longed for the incarnation of Christ, I am stung with sorrow and shame. Even now I can scarcely restrain my tears, so filled with shame am I by the lukewarmness, the frigid unconcern of these miserable times. For which of us does the consummation of that event, meaning the coming of Jesus Christ, fill with as much joy as the mere promise of it inflamed the desires of the holy men of pre-Christian times? Right? I mean, I love this because you see it, the fervent heart. We have this, because of the sort of sometimes rough nature of the artwork from the 11th century, I think we caricature men and women of this age as being these sort of robotic kind of people. But this is not the language of a robot, right? This is someone longing for God with a sort of existential religious impulse, like we would, I mean, I hope this is recognizable to you. I want to point out a couple things about it. One, that he speaks about the patriarchs looking forward to Christ, that sort of same thing we saw in the earliest centuries of the church, that the Old Testament is really about the coming of Christ in a prophetic way, and that he's chastising the sort of miserable times, right? That he's part of a reform movement. There's all this decay and decadence, and he is commenting on, a text which is, scholars state it differently, but it's at the oldest 1000 BC, at the youngest maybe 600 BC, an ancient text to expound on this. So his preaching is affective. He's wanting to stir up emotion, and he's really speaking out of his own emotional life. This is just continuing on in that same, just a paragraph later, on his commentary on chapter 1, verse 2 of the Song of Songs. Rather let him, I think I skipped one paragraph, rather let him who is the most handsome of the sons of men, speaking about Jesus, let him kiss me with the kiss of his mouth. No longer am I satisfied to listen to Moses, for he is a slow speaker and not able to speak well. Right? That's Moses' confession in Exodus. Isaiah is a man of unclean lips. Isaiah's confession in the calling of Isaiah in chapter 1 and chapter 6. Jeremiah does not know how to speak. He's a child, Jeremiah chapter 1. Not one of the prophets makes an impact on me with his words, but he, the one whom they proclaim, let him speak to me. Let him kiss me with the kiss of his mouth. She's taking this scriptural text and he's saying this is about Jesus in existential relationship with himself, and that he's thinking about other points in the Bible where lips are mentioned, right? The lips of Moses, the lips of Jeremiah. And then he's taking this romantic poetry and applying it to Christ. One of the sort of classic blunders, I think, of all early sort of, sophomore college students who read ancient texts is under every nook and cranny they're saying, oh, look, here's just unacknowledged homosexuality. And it's like, okay, well, maybe. I mean, all hypotheses are worth testing, I suppose. But one of the great tragedies is that of this sort of facile way of investigating the past is that there was such a rich breadth and depth of love and the expression of love in the past ages. We are the narrow ones, right? We have the friend that I see once a month, sort of a wild, sort of sexual appetitive life, interiorly, or sort of fantasized about and promulgated in pop culture. And then there's homosexual attraction, and it's just all these sort of narrow categories. Then it's like, no, there was the language of friendship. Actually, one of the great writers of friendship is a Cistercian, Aelred of Rievaulx, taking it in England. He writes a book on spiritual friendship. And the warm language with which people would speak together. The reason I'm not convinced, no one really even makes the claim about Bernard being homosexual, is that he actually writes in one of his sermons to his monks. He says, I've heard that some of you are engaging in sexual interaction together. Stop it. Christ forbids that. He preaches really hard against it, recognizing that it was a phenomenon in his time. But it was interesting. So when he's speaking about Jesus in this way, it's not just sort of some, unacknowledged sexual desire. It's actually the desire for humans for love, and recognizing it in this sort of deep kind of multi-layered way through the language of Song of Songs, applying it to Jesus, a man, him himself being a man, in this sort of rich vocabulary. Any questions or thoughts about the use of this text? Yeah.
There are two of his hymns in the Methodist hymn.
Oh, right.
Because they're writing
Yeah.
Jesus, thou joy of loving heart.
Yes.
Jesus, the very thought of thee.
Yes.
And
Yes, yeah,
He may have written Come Down from the Divine too, but
He
I
may
don't
have.
know that for a fact.
yeah, he did write some hymns, yeah, yeah. So his interpretation of an Old Testament passage is it's affective, it's Christocentric, and it's also allegorical. Look at the depth to which he's trying to sort of parse out subtleties of this text. I must ask you to try and give your whole attention here. Okay, Bernard, we're listening. The mouth that kisses signifies the Word, remember Logos, he's doing deep theology here, who assumes human nature. The nature assumed receives the kiss. The kiss, however, that takes its being both from the giver and the receiver, he's doing like phenomenological analysis of a kiss, is a person that is formed by both, none other than the one mediator between God and mankind, himself a man, Christ Jesus. See what's happening? He's taking Chalcedonian theology, what we studied from the Council of Chalcedon 451 about Christ being fully human, fully man, that controversy that lingered in the East as we looked at last time, and he's saying, we actually get a picture of it in the very nature of a kiss because it's the coming together of two things. And he's doing theology out of this text. Now, did the writer of Song of Songs have the two natures of Christ in mind when he was writing? Probably not. But Bernard feels every liberty to make allegory out of the word pictures to do theology. It's for this reason that none of the saints dared say, let him kiss me with his mouth directly, but rather with the kiss of his mouth. He's saying there's a layer of veiling and separation to keep distinct the divine nature of Jesus. In this way, they pay tribute to the prerogative of Christ. So he's doing affective, Christocentric, allegorical interpretation of this verse in Song of Songs. So this leads me to an excursus on medieval interpretation of the Bible. We've looked already in the last lecture series at sort of the typical, meaning finding types, finding sort of prophetic images, interpretation of the Old Testament, finding sort of images of Christ. But in the medieval era is when this comes into full bloom, and we see it in Bernard, so I want to unpack it. In theological writing, what's developed in this era is what's called the fourfold sense of Scripture, that every text in Scripture has 4 layers of meaning that are worth unpacking. And then, in addition, not just in theological writing, but in actual use of the Scripture, codification gets given to what's now called, what begins to be called in the 11th century, Lectio Divina. How many of you have heard that phrase, Lectio Divina? Some, okay. So it means divine reading, Lectio, you can see the Latin root there. So these are two things which kind of get given a definite shape in this era. I say that because, in a way, they existed in indefinite form through the centuries that preceded them. And so they're not inventing this stuff kind of, de novo, but they are giving definite shape to it. So we have earlier scholars kind of doing stuff like this. Of course, it's based on Jesus' invitation, right? This is from Luke chapter 23. Speaking about Jesus, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So right away, Christians read Old Testament texts saying, there's more going on here than just what meets the eye at the level of the letter. So scholars, so then the fourfold sense that gets developed in the Middle Ages is that every text has its literal meaning, its typological meaning, its moral meaning, sometimes called the tropological meaning from tropos, and its anagogical meaning, meaning end times, like yet to be fulfilled, something still there. So let me just take an example. Are most of you familiar with Exodus chapter 14, which recounts the fleeing of Israel out of Egypt, like across the Red Sea? It's familiar from childhood Sunday school stories, right? It's what? We just went through Passover last week, right? That's right, yeah. Happy Easter Wednesday. So that's a passage, right? And you could read that, and as critical scholars, they would say, well, this is just history. Actually, critical scholars would say this isn't history, this is myth-making after the fact, so legitimate, they tear everything apart. At its face level, it's history. So you could say, well, Exodus 14 is just that, a recounting of Israel leaving Egypt. But if we're looking at a typological reading, you could see that maybe the coming of the infant Christ out of Egypt, right? Christ is, in the Gospels, is portrayed as the new Israel. So in Matthew chapter 2, St. Matthew he recounts the history of Jesus fleeing to Egypt to avoid Herod and then coming back to his homeland of Galilee. And Matthew says, just as it's written in Hosea, out of Egypt I've called my son. Now, Hosea is clearly writing about Egypt's exodus, under Moses. But Matthew says this is a picture of Jesus' own life. It could be a picture of Christ breaking the bonds of death, right? Egypt being this image of slavery, death, the New Testament theology talking about being enslaved to death and sin, Christ breaking that yoke. That's sort of the message of Paul's letter to the Romans. The moral meaning could be, and this was used in preaching, that if are a Christian, you should leave behind the ways of Egypt, your former ways, right? And there's sort of a preaching prompt, right? If you are no longer a slave in Egypt, don't act like an Egyptian. Applied, meaning if you call yourself a Christian, don't go around philandering like all those idiots. That's what they do in Egypt, right? And then anagogical, you could talk about, well, we are yet to go to our promised land, right? We need to pass through something. Well, that would be death. So you could make a preaching point out of Exodus 14 that we are still waiting in a way to be fully released from the bondage of Egypt. So this sort of can you see, I'm not asking you to agree with the interpretation, but can you see how the interpretation could be teased out that way? And was actually done so in the earliest fathers of the church. And this gets given this sort of shape because in this era they're still reading the fathers. Remember, they're copying the manuscripts in their scriptoria. So they're reading the sermons of Augustine and they're seeing this method of interpretation. And it's it's in Bernard's day where they give name to this method. And in all of Bernard's sermons and all of his contemporaries, we see this way of work. So it wasn't just theory, they were both practicing it and giving name to the method. And what's really interesting is, boy, does this make the Bible come alive, right? Stories, even passages where it's like, man, at the level of the history, I just don't even know what I should be getting out of this, right? To be looking, well, is there a spiritual sense? Is there a lens that makes it make sense? Almost like, like sometimes, like as if there was like invisible ink that needed sort of the lemon juice application, applying the lemon juice of what we know about Jesus Christ to other things pop out here. This was just the normal way for reading the Bible, really until the Reformation era. It's not till the successors of John Calvin where they just sort of despise this way of reading. Any thoughts or questions about this sort of way of reading the Bible that would have been the normal way for the whole church in this era? Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe that gave thought to, things are bigger than, just a picture.
Yeah.
Really deep.
Yeah. There's no doubt in my mind that the fact that we are sort of an interpretive culture stems through many sort of wandering ways back to the fact that the foundation of Western history had such a Christian and before that Judaic influence, which is all about interpreting that there's meaning here, and where do we find it? How do we get it? Right? So we are no longer sort of corporately holding up the Bible and sort of all looking at it together. It's not in some Christendom, but yeah, we're holding up movies and speeches of famous people and kind of teasing it out. That's right. So this also only makes sense if you believe the Bible was written by God too, right? Because if Moses was just a guy, then there's no way that what he said has bearing on Jesus. But if, according to the internal testimony of the Bible and the Christian religion, it was the same God who said, hey, Moses, write this down, was the same God who said, okay, son, take on flesh of the Virgin Mary and die for the sins of the world. Only if it's the same God holding all those pieces together could there be sort of these interconnected sort of hyperlinks of meaning that makes it make sense. Otherwise, it would just be speculation. But they didn't think they were doing speculation. They weren't trying to be fancy. They weren't saying, I'm going to add some homiletical flourish to an otherwise somewhat dull text. They were thinking that they were really mining it. And just like they actually took analogy from nature, that in the same way you take sort of silver ore, and it just looks like rock with a tiny bit of sparkle. But you dig into it and you get the silver out. They treated texts the same way. So if you're interested in this, what's that called? The work that the great work about it is by de Lubac. You can buy this book, 3 volumes. You'll be fully done with the topic after you've read those. Also, the practice of Lectio Divina, practiced in an intuitive manner, but it's given this concrete shape by this guy who's a Carthusian. Hey, what's a Carthusian? You're about to find out. But breaking down this sort of structure of, well, how do we approach Scripture? Well, first we need to just read it. And then we need to meditate on it. And by that he means apply the imagination and the memory and sort of reconstruct it to one's mind and inhabit it in a sort of, with one's sort of perceptive faculties. And then once sort of in living in the world, turn it into prayer. So when you can picture the woman who's been caught in adultery being forgiven by Jesus, and he says, he who has the first sin, he who has no sins, throw the first stone, and you're kind of in the moment in your imagination, well then pray to Jesus sort of in the moment of that sort of meditative reflection, thanking him for his mercy. Wait, not just to that woman in the past, but to you. And sort of, in a way, it's a way of putting yourself into the world of the text. And then the last stage was called contemplatio, having sort of acquired a fresh knowledge of God from both Scripture and imagination, using Scripture, to then bask in that knowledge of God. And this is the fourfold structure of Lectio Divina, given shape in the 12th century, giving practical tools to all these people who are coming into these monastic reform movements who, between prayer offices, between 3 of them, they're going to be working in the fields. Between 2 of them, they have leisure time to read and write. And so they are reading the Bible for themselves, not just hearing it, and they're using this method, which also implies that the Bible was at hand. And so I want to talk about the Bible in the Middle Ages. What we know is that the Bible was very well known in this era. It's against this myth that nobody knew the Bible. If you're going into chapel 7 times a day, and at 5 of those, a Bible reading is being read, you're going to learn a lot of Bible, right? And we know that there was lots of commentary and translations of the Scriptures in the Book of Kells that we looked at in our first lecture. If you zoom in to the picture, you can see underneath the Latin letters, Gothic glosses of each word so that it can be understood. Preaching was always in an understood language, in a vernacular. The Bible was well known. We have an enormous amount of Bible production in the 12th through the 14th centuries. These are handwritten Bibles. See the development of the handwriting, the lowercase handwriting developed by Charlemagne. And the large quantity of these means that monks can have them even for private reading in a library, in a monastery. And so, yeah, there's a lot of biblical literacy. It's part of the myth, part of the Protestant myth is that no one knew the Bible until the Reformers brought it back. It's just not true. Now, I do want to say it is the case that for the 150 or so years before the Reformers, there was a great ebb in biblical literacy, as we're going to see next lecture. But in this era, there's a lot of biblical literacy. Okay, that's my end of my sort of excursus out of St. Bernard. Any questions about that? The Bible, how to read it, its promulgation? Okay. So Cistercian reform was not the only response to Cluniac excesses. Remember, Cluny sort of meant well and then became bloated. There was Cistercianism, and then there's also all the other Cs. And I'm going to go through these, and then we'll take a little break. Some monks wanted to return to a more solitary monastic life than Benedictine monasticism. Up till now, everything has just been sort of always coming back around to St. Benedict. But remember, there was Irish monasticism, which was really patterned off of desert monasticism, which was chiefly eremitic, meaning kind of you're just a hermit by yourself. Benedictine life has you thrown in with the brothers from the beginning, and that was intentional. Benedict's vision is that only when you're smashed close together with other people does your true self come out, and you realize how much you need a savior, right? Because you're rude and grumpy and sharp-tongued and gossipy, and it's like, oh boy, it's very easy to think you're a saint when you're by yourself. It's much harder to think you're a saint when you live in close community. But there's these different things of saying, well, kind of, there's got to be other visions. Cluny failed at its sort of task of making a pure monasticism. Maybe other forms could be tried. And so there's these other movements. They're not intentionally sort of, I'm going to break away. They often thought of themselves as Benedictines, but what they incorporated ended up becoming kind of a unique flavor of monasticism. So you have the Camaldolese, founded by St. Romuald, a very sober figure. He was tutored by a guy who was raised in an Irish-founded monastery, so we can see that sort of genetic connection. And he founds a commune of hermits. Now you might think, well, isn't that monks? No, no, monks weren't hermits. They were their life was oriented around togetherness. Hermits is oriented around living separately, but you happen to come together for worship in the morning once or twice. And the rest of the time, you're back in your cell. They were given sanction by the Pope in 1072. You're going to see that phrase, sanctioned by the Pope. Because remember, the Pope at this point has become sort of the great authority in the West in all matters, civil and ecclesial. We're going to talk a lot more about that next lecture. So there's the Carthusians. This is the Grand Chartreuse Monastery today. You could go there. Actually, there's a documentary called Into Great Silence that you can rent. This filmmaker wrote a letter to them in 1965, I think. Somewhere between 1965 and 1970. He said, could I make a documentary about your life? And the monks said, well, let us pray about it and get back to you. 20 years later, in the 90s, they said, we've prayed about it, and yes, you can come and live with us for a few weeks. So the film is just like the life. When we think of monks keeping a vow of silence, St. Benedict urged taciturnitatis, which is quietness. But Benedictine monks can talk. They're not supposed to be just chit-chatting about the weather, but you can talk. At the Grand Chartreuse, there was the grand silence. It's broken for, I think, like 1 week a year where you can chat. Otherwise, it's 100% silence. Do you know what they invented to communicate? Sign language. All sign language today has as its great-grandfather the sign systems of the monks who were under the grand silence but needed to communicate, there's a fire in my room and I need a bucket of water, where is the bucket, right? So this is, you can go visit this today, and if you've ever had chartreuse liqueur, the green stuff, have you ever had that? That's brewed here. That's all monks have to make their money somehow, and they make this gourmet liqueur. So that's, again, it's just like the Camaldolese, unconnected, sort of structurally, but the same spirit, the same animating spirit. Each of the monks lives in their own room. Food is sort of slid under the door, and they don't even have to eat with the brothers. They live the life of a hermit, except for communion each morning and Vesper prayers each night in the chapel. Carmelites, I couldn't find an old picture of Carmelite nuns, but I also wanted to point out that all of these orders are alive today. And so these are Carmelite nuns. I assume this picture was taken just within a few years ago. They have a sort of interesting history. There's this sort of myth around the Carmelites that they go back to the time of Elijah. They almost certainly don't. But the Crusades, which brought the Levant and Western Europe kind of in close contact, we're going to again look at them, led to some of these Carmelite monks sort of forming these Carmelite monasteries in Europe. And so they become an order. They end up getting brought under the sort of category of friar, which we're going to see momentarily. Others wanted to incorporate a monastic experience without being cloistered, right? All of these, you're in a place which you just never leave, right? You join there and you die there. There's something very haunting if you ever get to visit a monastery graveyard. It's like these brothers just spent the last 60 years within 30 feet of this grave. I mean, talk about the hidden life. But again, if this shouldn't sound too foreign to the Jesus of the Bible, who says, when you pray, go into your closet so that no one could know that you're praying, right? This hidden life of prayer and virtue. So, but still, there was a longing to not have to live a life ordered by prayer and rhythm and structure, but that wasn't cloistered, that was still kind of part of the missional, evangelistic impulse of the church, which has also always been a part of the church since St. Paul. And so the canons regular get formed. Canons is kind of another name for priests, and then regular means ordered by a rule, right? Which is the word where we get the word religious. Religious means following a rule. And if you hear sort of someone out of the Catholic tradition say, well, they're religious, they don't mean they're just earnest about their, faith. They mean they're under a religious rule, a monastic rule of some kind. So whereas some monks were priests, those priests would serve in-house. They'd celebrate communion for the monks. Canons regular were all priests who were parish priests but wanted to be regulated together in a life of community and structure, just like because these monastic houses were providing so much brotherly encouragement and spiritual study and all these listening to good teaching and all these things. They get called Augustinian canons because they take the rule that was written by St. Augustine in the 5th century. You want to know who a famous Augustinian canon was? Martin Luther, right? So the ground is getting paved. Very popular order. Every one of these orders, the way they would distinguish themselves publicly, one of the fascinating things of history is you learn from really sort of like Queen Elizabeth's time, Elizabeth I and back, dress was a highly regulated thing. Like what you wore communicated the rank of society you were in, the family you were connected to, the culture you were from, and you would go to jail for wearing even like a tiny little colored piece of piping that was an imposter to your true identity. So dress was a very highly loaded signification structure, and so it was for the monks. Every one of these orders said, well, we will have white tunic, black scapular. No, we'll have black tunic, white shoulder band. We'll have, white hood over, okay, we'll trim our things this long, and we'll do our haircuts like this, our tonsure. So they had all of these distinguishing marks. And historians in the Middle Ages could look at any picture and say, oh, these guys are canons regular because they're wearing the white habit with a black armis. That's the mark of canons regular. Premonstratensians are just a specific group who were fairly popular of canons regular. And you can see the nut is cracked, right? Whereas once there was in the West just Benedictinism, now there's this bouquet. And there's this idea of different ways of imagining Christian life and community together, which paves the way for the greatest theological force in the 12th and 13th centuries, the friars. With that, we'll take, let's just take a short break. If you can take a 5-minute break, that would be great. I got an enormous quantity of slides to get through still, and we'll resume it in 5 minutes. If you have questions, feel free to come chat with me up front. While we're gathering, we've still got 2 more minutes, but I just wanted to try to offer you an idea. The monastic vow of silence, I think, is this sort of very strange, odd phenomenon that when you first hear about it, I'm sure first time you ever heard about that, you're like, they do what? And I like to take retreats at monasteries, and people think I'm so weird. They're like, can you talk? That's like the first thing people ask. And this idea of being silent, we're such a talkative people. And one of the things that's one of the great wonders of getting to sort of dig into the life of your own soul is to see what's on the other side of the self-disciplined silence. And if you've never tried it, if you can ever find a time to carve out even 48 hours of total silence, like phone off, no email, no nothing, go somewhere, even if it's in your own house, like if you're, roommates or spouse or away or whatever, take 48 hours and try it and just see what happens, the 48 hours of total silence. Don't even talk to yourself. It's very interesting. My experience is, it's like these layers of the heart, which you just don't even know are there in the midst of busy, talky life. You kind of just have developed some sense of like, wow, like, what's going on inside this sort of inner planet, And it's a very rich exercise. It's why actually I think so many of the great religions incorporate silence as part of the spiritual disciplines, because it's kind of a precondition for, as it were, finding your own soul to begin a spiritual journey. So if you've never taken ever tried a discipline of silence, it's a very exciting thing to try. And emotions come up that, for me, my experience is, I'm like, where are these emotions coming from? Right, we just skim over it with language, and silence allows it to kind of really bubble its way up. So if you ever get a chance, I encourage you to take a silent retreat. I just discovered a new place not too far away called the Blessed Trinity Shrine Retreat out in Fort Mitchell, Alabama. There's 3 nuns out there. That's not a silent monastery. It's actually an order of, it's like an order of friars. But you can take retreats there and ask for it to be silent, and they'll give you a little hermitage, and a very nice place. So that's only about an hour away just south of Phoenix City. The other great one is Monastery of the Holy Spirit in Conyers, Georgia, about a 2-hour drive, and they're Trappists, which are Reformed Cistercians, right? Tales all the time, right? The Cistercians become wealthy and lax and need reform. And so Abbé La Trappe reforms them, and they become the Trappists. And so they're out in Conyers, wonderful monastery. They're a very hospitable guest house, and you can pray with the brothers. So yeah. Yeah.
These monasteries that we were just seeing have people there who live their whole lives there, they die there, they're buried there, but how did they get there in the first place? How do they recruit new members, I guess?
Great question. So they all are just by adults who come to them who are attracted to it. So
By word of mouth.
by word of mouth, right. And what's amazing is in towns where there are monasteries, there's a wonderful synergy. Like there's a little town in Wisconsin called Nazianz, Wisconsin, and there's a group of 11 Byzantine Catholic monks. And the whole town knows about them. And when someone's sick, they knock on the door of the monastery and they say, could you pray for this person? And there's this sense that like they're sort of reaping this harvest of spirituality, which the townspeople benefit from. And on the great feasts of Easter, there'll be like big meals together. And there's these different levels of interaction. And oftentimes there'll be outreaches of hospitality. The earliest hostels and hospices were born in monasteries. So outreach efforts will sometimes clue people in. There was a season in the sort of early Middle Ages where sometimes like noble families would give like youths to be educated, like a boarding school setup, and then that was kind of also like a funnel path to the monastic life. But these days it's all by voluntary association. And everyone who finds their way to be a monk, they all have very strange and interesting stories, each of them. I mean, some are chemistry professors who feel called to this religious life, some from a young age, some at an old age. There's all these different journeys that people will end up in monasticism. Okay, also about the friars. Friars are to be distinguished from monks. So these are technical terms, which we don't use technically anymore, but a monk means you're cloistered, right? Your life is in-house, facing in-house. Friar means you're on a mission. So the common thing is you're bound by a rule, but what's the orientation of your work? So friars are the ones out and about. Monks don't take a vow of poverty. Friars take a vow of poverty. Here's sort of what we think of when we think of a monk. If you asked any sort of person on the street, with a couple of colored pencils, draw a monk, they would probably draw something like this, right? Which is actually the image of a friar. Benedictine monks don't take a vow of poverty. Now, they don't have much, but it's the friars who take a vow of poverty. The friars were a very successful movement, and so it's they who have stamped their imprint on our collective consciousness, and is why we think of them when we think of a monk. This is Zurbarán's painting of St. Francis. The three knots on this is called a cincture. It's about poverty, chastity, and obedience, the three vows of a Franciscan friar. When we speak of friars, we're chiefly speaking of Franciscans and Dominicans. So I want to speak about these two. Later on, the canons regular and the Carmelites, who I mentioned, get sort of organized as friaries. That's not a word, but really we're talking about Franciscans and Dominicans. So let me say a bit about St. Francis. I had a professor who once said, St. Francis is the most loved and least imitated of all the saints in Christendom. Everyone's got a statue of him in their garden, and no one wants to give up wealth like he gave up wealth. We have these popular images of St. Francis, very sort of Victorianized, bowdlerized, and he did preach to the birds, but that was just a tiny piece of his much larger piety of poverty. So in reality, I think we should look at this. This is the face, a zoom in on the face of St. Francis by Zurbarán, which Francis himself was wanting to live the life of a repentant sinner. Like, it was very intense. It was not, oh, God bless the birds. I mean, it was Irish in its spiritual vigor. His biography, he's this rich kid who gets in a skirmish with his father. He ends up sort of renouncing it all, and then starts taking his Christian life very seriously, and he gets mentored by this older priest, and he gets a vision to rebuild the church, which he takes literally. He kind of collects stones to build this little chapel up, San Damiano. And he just starts kind of living this life of just sort of Christian simplicity. And it's winsome to the sort of wealthy people of Assisi. And these young guys start kind of joining him and living with him kind of out in the fields and like in these sort of makeshift huts and, beside a parish church. And they're just studying the scriptures and trying to be loving and following Jesus's pattern of living, right? Jesus lived very poor. And so they wanted to live poor. And taking every aspect of the Gospels as sort of something to be imitated. So the Franciscan order gets born out of this brotherhood, an emphasis on poverty and preaching. And his own sister, Claire, is like fully sold on the vision. And so she starts sort of independently, in total sort of tandem, a women's order of Franciscans, the Poor Clares of Assisi, again, still around today. 800 years is a pretty good lifetime already for an institution, and they're not done yet. So you have this sort of Clare and Francis kind of leading this community of men and women in this life of simplicity, which stood in contrast to the wealth of northern Italy at the time. One of the most famous sons was Bonaventure of the Franciscan order. He became the minister general kind of in that second generation when they got established. Again, Taylor's all his time, right? What becomes this earnest movement gets established, and then there's all these struggles within the next generation of Franciscanism of what did St. Francis really want, and yes, but what does this institution need to survive, and history repeats itself. But I just wanted to flag him as someone to know. St. Dominic, independently, disconnected from St. Francis, there's this great story about St. Dominic that when he's in his mother's womb, she gets this dream of a dog running around with a torch lighting the world on fire. And she saw this as a prophetic image, and indeed St. Dominic did light the world on fire with his preaching. Again, he was a canon regular, so we know what that is, right? Studying in a time of food scarcity, he really sold his books to help feed some of the poor. And he desired to create a structure that would, at this time, sociologists and historians say urban life is really starting to explode. There's sort of this wealth, and the cities are just booming. And so Dominic's vision is, man, all these people kind of population is increasing, resources are less scarce. Like, how do we sort of like bring the faith to this generation? How do we both convert people to Christianity, and how do we like educate all these new great quantity of Christians kind of living in one place? And so he founds this order of preachers in 1217. They're called Dominicans, and Dominic really liked this pun, that Dominicani, dogs of the Lord, right, in keeping this vision of him being the dog that would set the world on fire. They're called Blackfriars because they wore a black overcoat. And they were created for preaching and the salvation of souls. One of their favorite mottos is to study and to hand on the fruits of study. I love that. And some of these things, the institution, there are many Dominicans today, but they're also creating paradigms for the church. I have a buddy right now who got his PhD in theology from University of Chicago. He set up an institute in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and his mission statement is to take all that I learned from one of the greatest universities in America and give it away for free to Ethiopian students. So he's teaching graduate level theology in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia for free. A very Dominican vision. So the Blackfriars were really popular with the people. They were a very earnest outfit. So you've got these two orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and around them both, there's this sort of people who, they're not ready to take the plunge for religious life. Maybe they're married, maybe they're got some occupation they're embroiled with, but they want to join the movement. So this thing called third orders get created where just regular layfolk, tailors and butchers, could join the order and become sort of a tertiary, a sort of portion of it, like fashioning some of their prayer life and spiritual disciplines off of the same vision and disciplines of the order. So it's priests and monks and lay people kind of all working together, guided by these kind of common visions of simplicity and preaching, and and they're very, very popular. So one of the ways to keep track of all these things, I don't know when this custom began, but these days you'll see letters after people's names, and they tell you what order they are. OSB, Order of St. Benedict. That's supposed to be an S. OSIST, Order of Cistercians. Carthusians, Premonstratensians, Order of Preachers, Order of Friars Minor, the official name of Franciscans. So if you ever see those letters, that's what that means. I want to say not all revival movements were welcome. The ones I've looked at here are the Orthodox ones, which are sort of remembered with happiness, although Francis, he preached. He wasn't ordained. He didn't have theological training. He just was preaching love of God. And that was very suspicious to the authorities of his day, right? Like, well, where did you learn that? Right? Encountering, ironically, the same thing Jesus encountered from the rabbis. Where did this man get all this learning from? Right? The institution doesn't like the sort of unsanctioned teacher. So Franciscanism had a sort of tumultuous early reception until it was seen to be a loyal outfit to the church. There were outfits that were not loyal to the church. The Cathars, or as they're later called Albigensians, they were this sort of purity cult. So they were reacting against the same thing Francis and Dominic were reacting against, which is this sort of bloated, wealthy, ecclesiastical kind of thing. But they wanted to have a purity cult, and they were vegetarians, and they had these sort of outward austerities. But then they sort of brought into their teaching some teachings about kind of this dualism of, well, there's actually two equal forces in the world, good and evil. And all of a sudden people are like, yeah, the church is too bloated with wealth, and yeah, oh, wait, two equal forces, you know. And there was this sort of, you know, trying to suss out, and so they were anti-clerical. They wanted to have nothing to do with priests, with these holy orders. They didn't like the sacraments. So they revealed themselves as sort of not friendly to the church in a way that St. Francis's goal, his vision, was to take a church that was corrupt and rebuild it, right? A group like the Cathars, they wanted to say the church is corrupt, let's do this different thing over here. And what do we learn about heresies, right? That they're just choosing to do something different. And so they were recognized as a sort of late blooming heresy in the Middle Ages. So heresies aren't just a thing of the earliest periods of the church. And is any of this teaching new in the big picture of the church? That's all 2nd, 3rd century stuff, right? But it's popped up again under a different aegis. Interestingly, St. Dominic, he wanted to convert him. So he had public debates with Cathars, and he would try and he was a great debater. So he'd try and win them at their own argument to try and win them back to the Catholic faith, but he wasn't very successful. The proliferation of religious orders and the large numbers who were influenced by their ministry meant there were lots of Christians in Europe who needed places to worship. Plus, the Cistercian cultivation of land, the increase in the size of cities, and a general economic boom in the 12th century meant that there were resources for cathedrals. A brief history of cathedrals. Cathedral comes from the word chair, meaning bishop's chair. It's where the bishops were. And with the synthesis of the new Christendom, right, under Charlemagne, bishops and princes would sometimes be the same guy, right? Like a prince would get elected to be a bishop. So bishops were very powerful. And this idea of sort of demonstrating authority by impressive construction is ancient, right? As old as the Romans. We saw it at Justinian's Hagia Sophia, Constantine's Basilica in Rome. So that we've already seen in the history of the church, and the people of this time were cognizant of these great structures, sort of impressive building to commemorate both spiritual sort of triumph and civil authority kind of blended together. Most structures were fairly Spartan until the 12th century, what we would call Norman or Romanesque architecture, but now comes the era which we later would dub Gothic construction. Often Abbot Suger is of Saint-Denis in Paris. In the 12th century, this was his church he constructed, is credited as sort of inventing these sort of new ways of thinking about church, like breaking with symmetries and having this sort of symmetry and asymmetry and proportion and pointed arches instead of rounded and rose windows and all these things that were kind of seen would become later developed as touchstones of Gothic architecture. The reason it's called Gothic is because it was slammed by the neoclassicists, but their reason they did it this way is they were actually wanting to capture something of their sense of Christian ideas in aesthetic principles, like nature being made tame by self-discipline, right? You know, take something wild and give shape to it. And so this sort of structures of wildness and order, and also that would function further ever developing elaborate liturgies, which came out of Cluny, right? This time to develop these prayer offices and the music and also the preaching of the Christian tradition. If we've got this great preacher, we need people to hear him. So build a big pulpit, right? And the architecture also matched the function. So just give you a sampling. I did this slide 3 weeks ago. Isn't that crazy? It's like, wow, I never would have thought that it would have burned. The roof, it didn't burn down, the roof would burn since making it. So, so Notre Dame de Paris completed 1260. Amiens completed 1270. So note that, you know, the similar ideas with different executions. This is, and different levels of elaboration. Chartres. Westminster Abbey in England. See the twin pillars and, you know, okay, from pop quiz, what are some of the Christian symbolisms of the number 2 that would be really cherished by 2 spires? Come on, take a guess. The Incarnation, the 2 natures of Christ. Well done, yeah, right? Human and divine. The 2 testaments, old and new, right? The number 2 is a great number. So these aren't just sort of accidents. They're like, let's just have 2. There was symbolism in so much of the architectural choices. Cologne Cathedral was started in 1248. But the work stopped in 1450. Look at this. This is late Gothic. Look at this elaborate detail, on stuff that's hundreds of feet in the air. So this cathedral took 600 years to build. You can look at different art above Cologne, and in the background, there's always the cathedral under construction. So this is a painting done in 1685, and look, that's an old crane over a wall, right? This is just background, like, oh, yeah, still just hanging out, trying to build that cathedral. This is a photo from 1856, right? Started in 1200, so the construction, the Gothic era continues. Beautiful structures attached to the well-educated clergy who were involved in cathedral schools. Even prior to these structures, we've seen monasteries were places of education. This fostered the creation of institutions to give more definite shape to the work of education. Universities, right? The University of Paris, destroyed by the French Revolution and chopped to pieces. The Sorbonne still exists, but a shadow of what it once was. University of Paris came right out of the school of Notre Dame de Paris, the cathedral, right? All of the great universities were extensions of institutions connected to monasteries and cathedrals. Look at the dates of the founding of the earliest universities. Bologna, Oxford, Paris, Salamanca, Cambridge, right? This is this era. And you went there to study theology and the Bible, but to do that you had to learn how to read and write and basic literacy and actually a sort of a competent education generally. And so the liberal arts begin to become established as norms for education, right? Created by Alcuin in Charlemagne's court and established in the universities as basic education. Philosophy becomes a chief area of study. And this gives rise, so you've got universities, cathedrals, and all this, the flourishing of cities gives rise to scholasticism. And so this is where we're going to end today. The three wells of scholasticism, the things they were invested in, were the Bible, the writings of the church fathers, and classical philosophy. That's what you did all your study so that you could attend to these things. Common features of scholasticism is a conviction that truth was immediately discernible. They didn't have the perspectivalism of Renaissance and later Enlightenment conception that I'm just one guy over here trying to figure something out, or Kant's idea that it's just my mind kind of trying to organize things. For them, you were a soul learning about the things God had made, period. There was this sort of direct access to knowledge. The Bible was true, but it was also complicated, and you had to have this technical art and science to be able to tease out its meaning. That the fathers of the church spoke truly, but often at discrepancy with one another. What do you do about that? And an interest in teasing out claims to their full conclusion, really developing logic. Logic becomes sort of established in the West in this era after a 1,000-year hiatus as an independent discipline to say, well, if that's true, then this is true, then this is true, then this is true. It's in scholasticism, it's like the famous how many angels dance on the head of a pin. That's literally in Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. It's like, and it's a question of, they have bodies, they have form in it, but they don't have the qualities of a body, so they at once exist in the created order, but don't take up created space. Well, if that's true, let's get real about it. How many could fit on the head of a pin? So it's actually a way of talking about the dimensionality of invisible beings, put in a very memorable and often teased quotation. And there was a desire to use sort of philosophic consistency and rigor and logic to explain theology. Up until now, most theology has been kind of out of sermons and homiletical and responding to needs, and a heretic comes up and you preach against it. And now there's this idea of how do we systematize this all as sort of one great body of knowledge? And what's interesting is, the world we look at shapes the world we conceive of. If you're watching a cathedral being built up, I wonder, there's an interplay there, a back and forth of, let's make a clear, solid structure containing all of the teaching of the Bible. And so it's born. There's a school of the Victorines. There's some very early pioneers with a strong philosophical realism, encouragers of the liberal arts. They tutored Abelard, who becomes sort of the great first scholastic theologian, properly as we would call him. he's kind of the first ever professor to get a cult following. You know how professors get that sometimes? They got the kind of the band of students that are following, you know, catching every word. He had just hordes of people in Paris who were listening to his teaching. His famous work was called Sic et Non, Latin for yes and no, where he'd ask these questions and he'd show how the Bible and the fathers would give mixed answers. Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. So he was actually really putting forth ambivalence, and his desire was pedagogical, to teach dialectic, like, well, how are you going to go back and forth between these things and arrive at a central truth? But also he begins to establish what becomes sort of the chief tool of scholasticism, the distinguo. If you reach an impasse, make a distinction. So sometimes, make a distinction. In this instances, the answer is yes. And when this is the circumstance, the answer is no. You make that distinction, and it can both be yes and no. Do you see? He's the one who came up with the idea that there are 7 sacraments of the church. He has this famous relationship with Heloise. You know, part of his popularity, he kind of gets this big head. His tutors chastise him. And there's this woman who's like super brilliant and kind of an intellectual peer, and they're swapping ideas, and it becomes romantic, and they have this affair, and then like he puts her away to like try and keep it hidden. You know, there's all these, it's kind of the stuff of medieval legend now. But then her father is so mad, he sends some guy to come castrate Abelard, who then ends up living kind of the retired life of a monk, and they write these passionate letters, which you can still read. So that's Abelard and Heloise. It's sort of like a 1-2, kind of like, you know, if there's George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, Peter Lombard's kind of the Thomas Jefferson. He's the great scholar. Abelard sets the stage. Lombard comes in and says, this is it right here. And he writes the 4 books of the sentences, which for 300 years was the benchmark for theology. You couldn't get your master's degree in theology without writing a commentary on Lombard's sentences. Here's a 14th century version of it. Look, his commentary on the sentences. They are pronouncements, sentences like the way a judge makes a sentence, on these ambiguities of how to interpret Scripture. Like, what is the meaning? How could it be that Jesus says this here, but it says this in the Old Testament? Here's the distinction, here's a definition. So it's at its heart biblical commentary using philosophical tools and quoting the fathers. So yeah, Lombard sentences. Alexander of Hales, another great scholar. Here's a turning point, which we're going to see as we're going to bring together a lot of these threads in our lecture, my lecture next week. It was Alexander of Hales who said for his theology students, you know, rather than just study the Bible directly, my textbook will be Lombard sentences, right? All of a sudden replacing the primary text. Bummer. He writes what might be one of the first early systematic theologies. I'm clipping along because I want to come to the great Thomas Aquinas. He's a Dominican, right? That's a word that means something to us now, right? He's a part of the order of preachers. He's a priest. He's a quiet student. His peers teased him. They called him the dumb ox. And his tutor said, here's this great quote that I can't remember. Something about how this dumb ox will speak louder than everybody else. A man of immense talent and learning. The more you learn about Aquinas, the more staggering it is, his intellectual competence. I mean, the quantity of works he produced is insane. First of all, remember, writing is done on vellum, deerskin, with ink that you make yourself and handwrite. He would have 4 scribes, and he would dictate 4 different works concurrently, paragraph at a time. So he'd be talking about, okay, commentary on Galatians, break, so they could write it all down. Okay, philosophical analysis of this thing, break, write it all down. You know, and he would just go, and he would just dictate and write and read. I mean, it's just amazing. And it's still so fresh. To read his writing is amazing. His Summa Theologiae, which means sort of the gathering together, the bringing together of theology. It's definitely one of the most careful and brilliant theological works ever written. I almost gave something away. What's interesting when you read the Summa, again, think of the mind that would dictate this. He takes a point of theology, like the virtues that a Christian is supposed to cultivate, or the natures of Christ, the 2 natures of Christ. And he begins by and he breaks it down by sort of sub-questions, like, well, these are the questions we need to deal with. Does he have 2 natures, or did he have 2 natures past tense? do those two natures, are they equally in proportion to each other? You know, he's doing the sort of unpacking of the theology he's received. With each sub-question, he begins by listing all of the things which he thinks in the end are wrong, all of the counter-evidence that has been thrown at him, and then he says, he has said contra, on the contrary, and he produces this sort of deft piece of evidence that has more gravity than all the opposition, and throws it all into question. And then he provides a synthetic answer of how all those things could be right, the sic et non, and then he answers the refutations on their own terms, one by one, in reverse order. He did that by dictation. I'm already confused just trying to explain it, right? And he's doing this by topic. So when you read the Summa, I tried to read it for a few years, and I'm like, this makes no sense, until someone explained this. Look to the very middle of the question and look for the but I say. Said contra, but I say. Read the but I say. That's what he's trying to establish. Then read the counter data and the on the contrary. Then read the counter data, and then reread the but I say. And then you're like, oh my gosh, he has taken into consideration every angle before I could even disagree. I mean, it's amazing, the work that he does. So the Summa is just incredible. It's still the standard textbook for theology in Catholic seminary. Okay, here's a mind-blowing connection. The scholastics wanted to be consistent with their philosophy. Aquinas was reading this new philosopher called Aristotle. He was obviously not new. Aristotle lived in the 5th century BC. Aristotle had been translated into Arabic and was treasured by Spanish Muslims. Especially, there's these two great scholars in Averroes and Avicenna. They were sort of medieval Aristotelian philosophers working in Arabic. They were Muslim by faith conviction. Though their works get translated into Latin, and Thomas is reading that. So remember how we see this sort of Islamic world sort of blooming out of the south and the sort of Western world and the Battle of Tor. We see them interacting that actually Aristotle, which Aquinas would use as the philosophic paradigm to explain the great truths of Christianity, right? He receives those tools from the fact that Muslim scholars in Spain were great scholars and careful tradents, meaning handing down, of classical learning. It's amazing to me that that's how it worked out. Post-issue on the Summa, Aquinas is not recognized for the genius he is right away because he used Averroes, who was recognized as sort of in himself as kind of maybe a danger to Christian theology. This is a very early picture of Thomas standing on Averroes. So kind of, crushing him, and Thomas did take beef with Averroes. He didn't just adopt Averroes's anthropology or philosophy whole hog, but he took a lot of the Aristotle and worked with it. Interestingly, Thomas on his deathbed is legendarily supposed to have said, it's all straw. And he was pointing like he had his works nearby. It's all straw. Right? It was very interesting. Whether or not that's true, it should be true. But I think what it shows is actually that, lastly, Duns Scotus, this is where we get the word dunce. This guy, I can't even make sense of him. Like, it's so technical. It's just like you read people and you're like, this guy's too smart for me. I can't understand it. Scotus is one of these guys. But he embodies, the word dunce comes from because they thought he was just not making sense, when in fact he was just too smart. But he kind of shows that there kind of emerges these different schools of thinking, Franciscan or Dominican theology. Like, they would differ. The Franciscans, like Scotus, like Alexander of Hales, said that even if Adam didn't sin in the Garden of Eden, the Son of God would have become incarnate anyway. Very interesting, right? You can see kind of how logic is inviting them. But Aquinas said, no. The incarnation was actually caused sort of by a functional necessity, not a total necessity, but a functional necessity by the sin of man. But you can see it, I hope maybe you can tease out why logic sort of prompts one way or the other. But what I want to say about that is that even though the academic learning is so intense, there's another story, a true one actually, where Aquinas visits Bonaventure, who we looked at just a moment ago, the Franciscan, and Aquinas has been reading Bonaventure, and he says, Bonaventure, where did you get this great learning? And Bonaventure shows him into his little one-person chapel with a kneeler and a crucifix, and he points to the crucifix, and he says, here's where I have learned everything I've ever written. right? So there's devotional piety hasn't been forgotten in the midst of academic study. It's 2:10, so I will save these for next time, which means next time we won't have only the bad stuff. We'll also have some good stuff. Okay, see you guys next week.